Yeah, thanks so much for wow, what a turnout. That's really really cool. Thanks everybody for coming, and hi to everybody out there in internet land. I'm super honored to be here and share the stage with Tim and Kenny. So we figured today that we'll talk about mainly about just getting some great guitar tones, and we might dabble and talk a little bit about the aux as well, because that's a really cool way of getting some great tones. But we figured to begin with that we'd actually just talk about guitar tones in general. And one of the things that I find interesting, for me personally at least, is as a guitar player, I'm the kind of guy who spend a lot of time nerding out on guitars and amps and pedals and stuff like that. But I have to be honest, I don't know all that much about recording. So you could throw me in a room, you could throw me in Ocean Way with all the best microphones and the greatest room and everything, and I probably wouldn't know how to dial those sounds in. But luckily we have two guys who know a lot about that stuff. So the goal here is to basically pick their brains, and hopefully you'll get inspired to do some recording and getting some great sounds of your own. So I wanted to start with you, Kenny. What is great tone to you?
Great tone to me is when you're not thinking about the tone. It's when you can forget about it and just kind of get straight from your heart to your hands, and your mind kind of gets removed from the equation. I find that I'm always playing my best when I'm not really thinking about it. So if I get a tone that's really good, I can relax and not be worried about, wow, it's too bright, it's too dark. I can just stop thinking all those thoughts and play music.
So is that both a sound thing and a comfort zone in terms of how you play as well?
Oh yeah, it's definitely a sound thing. And it's also what makes your hands feel good. It's such a physical act of playing. So for me, it's really what makes my hands feel good, what makes me relax, and what makes me think more about the song and the music I'm making, as opposed to my pedals or my gear or any of those. So great gear really gets you to the place where you can forget about the gear.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you, and you record all the time, so you know. But for me, I remember when I got my first 50-watt Marshall. I was 17 years old, and I listened back, and it literally changed my playing. I had an amp that wasn't that great prior to then, a series of amps, but I got this 50-watt Marshall. It was in 1970, let me think, 75 maybe, and it was like, it was almost like edible, the thing this amp did for my hands and my playing. So it really can be that profound. The thing about recording is, you know, we all use 57s, SM57s a lot, and so you're taking this glorious sound coming out of an amplifier and you're putting it through something the size of a quarter, and then you're trying to bring it back to life. And that's really the hardest thing about recording. And that's one of the things about this box that's really nice, is it kind of solves some of those. You can immediately get kind of in-your-face great sound from your amplifier. For me, great tone is finding a sweet spot. And it's usually not that dirty, definitely not that clean. Most of my clean tones are actually secretly dirty.
Right.
They're just, because you want the amp to come up and compress. If your amp's too clean, it won't compress, and you just get all this transient, these spikes. So it's kind of a little bit of trickery there, although not. And I think you'll agree, it's often the simplest solution, right?
Yeah, it's really true. Really.
Can we hear? Like, can you dial in some?
That's pretty good. If I roll the volume knob down to like 7, maybe I can get it. Very useful. Playing a lead line, maybe I'll pull it up to 10. See, it's not that dirty. Yeah, I love it. I mean, it's. I usually try and find a sweet spot that's really not that dirty, and you can actually use pedals in front of this thing really effectively. This one's too far for me to reach, but. I don't even know that pedal, but it's the Butch Walker Overdrive, and it sounds really good. I think that's really it with your volume knob. And the other thing I like to use a Vox style amp I found with the OX. I mean, you like to use a Fender style amp primarily, you think?
I like, actually a Vox amp I've used as well, and they work fantastic with the aux. But a Fender amp, what I found about the aux, is talking specifically about that, is that any piece of gear that you run through is going to slightly. They all have a sound to them. No matter what you run through, it's gonna do something to your sound. What I love about the aux, first of all, it's consistent. No matter where you go or what day you plug into it, and if you have your presets, it's going to sound the same. What I really like about it with Fender amps, I really like playing through Fender amps, and a blackface Fender amp is a beautiful thing, but a lot of times when you're recording the high end of them, it can be kind of crackly, and if you play hard, it kind of craps out on you. The aux, with some of the speaker cabs in there, it sort of smooths out that top end, so I actually have gotten my best Fender guitar sounds through the aux because it just sounds better. That's how I can describe it.
It makes the top end sweeter then.
It definitely makes the top end sweeter.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
So just for those of you out there who might not know what the aux actually is, so the very short explanation of this is that the aux is a reactive load box and a speaker cabinet and room simulation device. So it essentially allows you to take your favorite tube amps, whatever they might be, and plug into the aux, not necessarily plug into any cabinet, so you can play at any volume, and you can use it to record directly. So right now, the sound you're hearing, we're not playing through the speakers of the amps. It looks like that because we have microphones on there, but it's actually all the sounds you hear are just the amp part of the amp, not the speakers, going into the aux and then straight out to the PA. So the benefit is that you can record at any volume. You can also use it as an attenuator, so if you are playing live and you want to bring down your amp a little bit, because what Tim and Kenny talked about getting a 50 watt Marshall or a Vox AC30 to the place where it will sound like it just did. That's a pretty loud experience, especially for those guys sitting on the first couple of rows here. So you can bring it down to the level that's tolerable, but at the same time still run the amp as hot as it needs to run to sound the best it can. So it's really, it's a live device for bringing down the volume for your amp. It's a really good recording device for basically getting studio quality tones without owning a bunch of microphones and a killer room and a ton of different cabinets.
Yeah, I think both of us have pretty full-on studios. Mm-hmm. You even more than me. But there's a lot of gear in those studios that we've spent a lot of money on, and it's pretty nice to just fire this thing up and plug it in direct. So you can bypass all of that. If you're just starting out, you can get a recorded sound that's right in your face that we run through our mics and our mic pre's, and I have a vault downstairs where it's stadium loud. You have a tracking room, right?
Yeah, I have a full-on tracking room.
Full-on studio. Yeah. So it's nice to have a device. And the thing about this that's great is that you can use your favorite amps. I've used the Axe Effects and I've used the Kemper. The thing about this, one of the great things about this is you're using your favorite amp. If you're in love with your amp, you get to use it. And I found with this that if it works better with an amp that has 5 knobs than 18 knobs. So it works great with, like traditional simple amplifiers, I found.
It's really true, and the thing about the traditional simple amplifiers, especially ones that are non-master volume amps, is they're loud, and so depending on your space that you're playing live or you're recording in, you've got like your great, vintage Marshall or your reissue of a twin that sounds amazing, but they're loud, and a lot of times, your neighbors or the other people in your house or even at the gig, you can get a great sound at a low volume, or you can get a great sound with no volume coming out of the amp at all. So it really, with vintage amps, it's just been fantastic.
One of the other things that I find interesting, and it's something I really realized when starting to use the aux, was that a lot of the favorite tones that we associate, great albums, a lot of those were actually in the studio, were done using a lot of the same amps, and it's really how you mic them up and how you treat it afterwards that makes the difference. So, again, talking about like a 50-watt Marshall, there is hundreds of amazing tones on albums out there using that, that amp, but they all sound different. And it's one of the fun things about the aux is that you can go into the editor. You can't see it, but I have an iPad here that's running the editor, where you can go in and change all these things, different cabinets, different microphones. Oh, there we go.
I knew it.
Nice timing. So you can go in and change all these things, and you can actually hear by yourself how those microphone changes, how much room mic you put in there, how that affects the sound.
For me, the room mic is probably the guiltiest pleasure about this. Can you exaggerate the room mic on my sound? More. See, I can't get that at home. You can get that at home because you have a big room. But for me, it's just... how I imagined it as a kid, where you're not only hearing your amp, but you're hearing the room. It makes you play better. It's really fun.
On a couple of the different presets, there's different amounts of room and different microphones for the room, and you can compress the room. You can add a compressor to the room mic and blow up the room and get like a great Black Keys blown out room sound. And I mean, there's just the options are really good. I just finished a tour, and I used the aux on the tour.
Was that with Kenny Chesney and big stadiums, right?
Yeah, and we just finished our tour, and the engineer, the front of house, came to my house, to my studio before our tour started, and we took the aux and we came up with a couple of presets that he liked, and then once the tour started, we fine-tuned those, and this guy's name is Chris Raybould, and he does Chesney, he does Bruno Mars, Justin Bieber, Lady Gaga. He's a really good front-of-house sound man, and he says that the aux is like the best thing he's heard. I actually have a clip
yes, please,
that I could play. Would this be a good moment?
Yeah, it would be
to play
perfect.
it?
Perfect moment.
I have a clip of Chris was kind enough to make a little quick MP3 of a guitar solo playing live. So what I had is I had an old matchless amp, and we ran into the aux, and the front of house only heard the aux, but I used the attenuator on the aux to have the matchless right behind me, so I could open it up and have the amp really work, but it wasn't that loud on stage. Because it's a fascinating thing. The larger the place you play, you really can't play loud. You think you could play as loud as you want in a large venue, but it's surprising that you need to keep the volume down. So, should I play the click?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
And he name checks me at the end of the solo, so I'm embarrassed and sorry about that. I'll go ahead and apologize. So, and I'll just say that I have really struggled with getting my sound playing these big places. It's hard, and it never. We had these ISO boxes, and they sounded like shit, and I could never get it to sound good, and so that to me just sounds like my amp in a good studio. I was really happy with it. So
Sure does.
Can you share sort of how you had the aux set and which amp you were using for that?
yes, I was using the 212 Honkin Silvers preset. And if you go through the aux, there's a preset called 212. And what those are, it's a Vox setting, and it's the silver, those silver Alnico speakers in an old Vox amp, which I have. And we just dialed through all these different speaker cabinets, and for what we were doing, that's the one that the front of house guy liked best. It's just a really warm, kind of fat, thick sound that would really cut. Still had some nice top end to it.
And you're using that with which amp?
Through like a 93 matchless.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay. So that's one of the fun things about the aux as well, is that you actually get to sort of match things up, because the Honking Silvers is sort of like a silver phase twin kind of thing.
Yeah.
So now you get to match that up with a matchless.
And to me, a matchless is identical to a Vox in just family-wise.
Yeah,
The Sonic
very
family.
similar, yeah,
So
yeah.
that would work for me too.
So it's also a way to kind of try out some speakers. I mean, typically, not a lot of us go to the extent of actually buying new speakers and swapping them out and testing them and figuring out, I actually turned out I like greenbacks more than vintage 30s or whatever. I mean, some people do, but not everybody. But this is actually a cool way to try your amp with different speakers, because the speaker is such a big part of the sound that it can make a massive difference.
I really like the Greenback 412, probably. I mean, you tend to gravitate towards your favorite. Like, I can find my favorite sound in there. For me, it's one of the 412s. And then I like the 57 and the M160 combined with it, right? Is that the...
Yeah.
Is there, yeah. And then I like the stereo room sound, because you get this, it's like in this room, you'd hear that corner and that corner, especially on headphones. But yeah, so that for me, those are kind of my favorite settings.
So do you have, depending on the amp you use, do you have different settings on the aux, or?
I have to confess, I kind of go for that's my favorite one. And once I arrive there, I just start making sounds with different guitars, different levels of gain from the volume knob and pedals, and I tend to leave it in one spot. I don't know about you, but when I find something that I like the best, I
Absolutely, yeah.
It's if you're creating music or any kind of artistic endeavor, if you can make everything as simple as possible so you can just make music, then that tends to, you get more done. So I tend to find one thing that I like the best. If I had any advice to offer, don't worry. If you spend the money on the thing and you're not maximizing all of its options, that's okay. Find the thing that sounds best to you, stick with it, and then just make music.
That's a great piece of advice, because you can spend so much time just fooling around with the gear, and you find a couple things that you like. It's just with pedals, it's the same thing. There's some multi-effect pedals where I don't know, 75% of what they do, I'm not really sure I know, but I find a couple things that I really like, and that's what I use. I like, there's a speaker called In Memory of Skydog, and Skydog is Dwayne Allman, who played through a Greenback 412. So I really like, it's funny that you talk about that 412. I love that 412 thing that they have. It's great.
So speaking about, getting things done, I would assume as session guitar players, the both of you, that, especially today, but probably always, there's always this kind of demand to, get a great tone fast. And, just...
I've never been allowed more than 30 to 60 seconds to get a tone in a professional situation. Never.
It's really true, and I'll just add this, and no offense against the people who play drums in this room, but when you play on a recording session, they spend 30 minutes getting a drum sound, and then in the mixture of the rooms, and then, you over there on the guitar, what do you got, and you play it, and they go, that's good, and I mean, am I right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Please. Exactly. Just don't annoy us. We got stuff to do.
So here's a question. So interestingly, I was talking to James Santiago, who's one of the great guy and one of the real brains behind this product. I can't take credit for any of this. I started at UA after this was done. But James is really one of the main guys behind it. And he told me that he was talking to Larry Carlton at one point and asked him about the gear he was using in the studio. And he said, I don't know, I just showed up and played and somebody else did that. How did you guys get into the whole studio part of it, getting to know microphones, miking techniques, rooms, all this stuff?
I got into really learning about guitar sounds when I first started to get record dates, and the engineers really helped me. You get with an older engineer who was a nice guy and could see that I was a young guy and really didn't know that much about what I was doing. He'd say, look, you know, you always want to put a 57, you don't want to put it right on the cone, you want to put it off the cone, and you just find people, you get around people that impart information to you. And then the other thing is, in this economy and with record budgets shrinking, in my studio I have to do a lot of it myself because the budget's small. I have to. And so I learned how to engineer and how to get guitar sounds because I had to.
I moved to LA in 1979, and it was different in the 80s, and I started working. I learned on the job. I knew nothing. I just showed up and pretended to be someone worth hiring. In those days, you would go in with your Marshall, and somebody else would bring their Marshall, and so you might have 3 or 4 Marshalls sitting there, and for a clean sound, you'd use a Fender Deluxe. So Steve Lukather would have his pair of Fender Deluxes for clean sounds, and then you have his pair of Marshalls for, you know, playing the solo on Dirty Laundry or whatever. And so it was pretty simple back then, but you're right, it was the engineers who kind of saved us, because you would just show up and they would work hard on the sound. There was more time taken on guitar sounds back then.
It's really true.
Yeah, and then in the 90s, we all started building racks, and I was telling these guys as we were walking in, I kept trying to make my rack sound as good as Mike Landau and Dan Huff, and I never did. And by the time I made my rack sound that good, racks were over. So I had this big, tall rack, and it sounded great. At one time, I had 3 preamps in it. I had the Bogner Fish, I had the Bradshaw, and then I had the Soldano. 3 preamps. It was like glorious. I wish I'd kept it. But then everybody switched to amps, and I did too. So when Nirvana showed up in I think 1993, everything changed, and it became about just the amp and the guitar, which was really a welcome thing. It was really nice. So it did change over the course of time. But you're right. Once, you know, putting a 57 right where the paper meets the cone, I'm amazed. Sometimes that's all you need. And so there was a lot to learn, but it always seems to come back to the basics with guitar.
So one of the things kind of in that same vein is that guitar players in general, you specifically, Tim, have been starting to use YouTube and social media quite a lot. Do you find it's the same requirements sound-wise to get a good sound there? Do you use the same gear, or is that different?
I think one of the reasons why rock is not as popular as it used to be is that the end user product in music is not high fidelity anymore. And so what that does to distorted guitars is make them sound not as good. They get pixelated. The top end on a distorted guitar sounds great on vinyl, and it sounded pretty good on a CD. But you get to these like YouTube and Spotify and platforms like that, distorted guitar gets mangled a little bit by just the fact that it's not high definition. And so I don't really worry about that, but it is better if you don't make things too bright, because if they're too bright, that brightness gets harsh really quickly.
So I was thinking that, you know, when you have these guys who are, you know, using YouTube and you know, trying to make a living that way instead of the, you know, the more traditional way of session playing or finding a band and stuff, One of the things that I find the guys I like to listen to there are the ones who have a good tone and, you know, that stand out that way. Obviously, they have to play good as well. And I think that, you know, something like the Ox, especially for people who don't have room, like, you know, a great tracking room or an ISO box or something like that, it's really a way to get a great sound without, you know, basically doing it in their basement or their little man cave or whatever.
Well, you can get it. The thing about going into your amp, going into the aux, straight into your recording platform, straight into Pro Tools or whatever you're using, the sound is right in your face. And that's a very desirable and modern and important thing, and a thing that they tried to do in the art of recording for decades is get the sound right to where you feel like it's right in your face. And this does that.
Yeah. So another question was that, do you, if we kind of look at the, you know, the three main ways of playing guitar, you know, there's live playing. We talked about that with you, Kenny, and there's like recording. The last thing is practice. Do you guys ever practice, or Kenny, do you practice, or is it all work? Or
I do practice, you know, and what I try to do is I like to get up really early, and so I have this routine, and I can't do it every day, but I'd say a good 5 days a week. I have about an hour where I get a cup of coffee, and this is like 5:30 in the morning, and I go down and I practice guitar for an hour, and because it's a physical activity, and you know, as you get older, you know, you got to keep your body in shape, and part of your fingers are part of your body. So I spend about an hour in the morning, and I just practice I have some scales that I run, and then I find some records that I like to play to, or I'll find a playlist, right now I like the indie music playlist, and they just play all this kind of wacky sounding stuff. It's really fun to play to, so I just sit down there with my coffee in the morning and I play for an hour, and I know that whatever I'm going to do the rest of the day, if I got to get back to playing, I've got my hands going. I think it's like being an athlete in a way, for me.
Yeah, if you can play as much as possible, and that is a great point. The most pleasurable thing I can think of is putting on, say, Motown songs and playing along with them. I mean, it's great to do scales and do kind of like eating cardboard kind of practicing, but it's so fun. I mean, I would balance that with just putting up, and it trains your ear too, because if you can start to pick up what you hear immediately playing with songs, I think that's it's so pleasurable.
For me personally, I always kind of struggled with finding the right solution for practice in terms of just getting a good sound, which is what we're basically talking about here, is because I live in an apartment and I don't have the luxury of having a room. So there's always this thing that, you know, you can't wake up the kids, you know, the wife is getting agitated and all these things. And most of the solutions I found was really, I mean, it worked as a means to practice, but in terms of actually feeling that you have a great sound wasn't always the best. And the Ox, when I got one, was really a revelation in that sense, because suddenly it allowed me to use my main amp and just play with headphones. And Tim was talking about the room mic. There's an interesting thing about the room mic in the sense that if you close mic any sort of amp, it gets that really right in your face kind of sound, which is great for recording, but in terms of how it feels when you're playing, it can get a little bit like, ooh. It definitely reveals everything, and it can feel a little weird. So adding a little bit of that room mic just kind of helps you kind of relax a little bit and suddenly get a good sound. So
Could I maybe play? You want to play some lead or something?
Sure. Yeah. I'm gonna crank up the room mic on the sound of it. And this is that 412 amp.
I thought we should just play. For
I think I just got schooled just then.
Yeah, that's why you got to practice. I think there's actually a question down there.
Tim, are you using compression on your guitar? That's just in your amp.
No, it's see, this is the difference between a humbucking style thing and that beautiful open. It was the neck pickup, probably, right? So that's going to sound much more open and much less compressed. But this guitar is going to sound compressed just by the nature of the humbucking pickup and the way I have it set. So you're absolutely right, but that's a great tone too. This
But
is
if
just
I-
compressing itself.
If I switch to my, it'll get a nice fat. This is my travel all-purpose piece of shit guitar that I now love.
Yeah. So, but another thing about the compression was that definitely a lot of it is coming from the guitar, but a lot of it is also coming from the Vox because they have a tendency to compress
Yeah.
by themselves,
Yeah.
especially when you turn them up.
Yeah, it's natural, and if you don't want that, that's a single coil at the neck. You can have a much more open
Yeah.
thing.
So just getting quickly back to the practice thing, because one of the cool things about the aux as well is the fact that there's actually, you can see it up here on the side. Here, I'll turn it on. So there's actually a couple of built-in effects, which is pretty neat, especially both if you want to record with it or if you just want to track with it. If you just want to track with it and not have it recorded. But as for practice, if you have an amp and you have an aux, you actually have a pretty good basis for any kind of sound that you might need, aside from like specialty effects like choruses and tremolos and stuff like that. So I'll play a little bit and then I'll leave it to the experts over here. I play a little bit of a different style, but right now I have an amp down here that's way more high gain, and I actually added some delay and reverb coming from the aux. So everything you hear is basically just the amp and the aux. Oh.
Really bright. It's funny, we came up here and I didn't even turn the knobs on the amp. I just heard something and started playing. So I think I may have just opened it up a little bit. Use a little more brightness. Did that get brighter?
Do you want me to turn it up? Yeah. I can do that. I think it's on the normal channel.
It's on the high channel. So which tone would go?
That's the one over on the left.
I need help. That should make you feel good. It's like, I have no idea what I'm doing right now. Could be louder.
So getting back to tones, do you have, in terms of, if you have to layer a song with specific sounds, would you go for one amp and then different guitars, or would you switch amps, or how would you go about doing that?
I think every song is different. I mean, that's a tricky question. I mean, I really think that you just try stuff, you know. And I watched the YouTube panel that was on before us. I sat out here and listened to these guys talk, and they said some really interesting things. And one of the things they said that I think is so great, and you actually might have said this, is that, well, I fail every day. And I think that's such a great thing to say, where you try stuff, and you know, you might be building a song and you do 3 or 4 different guitars and play through the same amp, and you go, nah, that's not quite it. Well, switch to a different amp, you know. Or the great thing about the aux is that if you have your one amp and that's what you have in your home studio, well, you just switch around to different speakers, because I think that a lot of amps are really similar. There's just 2 or 3 basic food groups of amps, and a lot of them are really similar. And what people, I think a lot of people discount how important speakers are to the sound of amps. I mean, they're hugely important. And what I love about this is I can play through 2 or 3 different presets, and it sounds like I'm playing through 2 or 3 different amps. And so you just use your ears and search around. And the one other thing that I want to make sure that I brought up is that the other great thing about the aux, in, you know, once again, in our economy of smaller studios or your home studio, is you can just mic up one person in your studio with live mics, and wow, but I want to have 2 guitars. Well, take your favorite amp and play through the aux for your other guitar. And that way you've that way both people can play live together and have good speaker sounds, but you don't have the capability to mic up 2 amps. So that's for my home studio. That's been a huge thing for me, because a guy comes over and he's the artist and he wants to play guitar. We've got the drummer in the drum room and we're tracking, and he wants me to play with him. Well, I'm just going to plug into the aux and run straight to tape. He can play in my amp room, and we can play together at the same time, and everybody's happy.
Yeah, if I layer, sometimes I'll use the same amp because we have to move so fast. Once again, it's the economic thing too. And then the idea that people are hiring you and paying you. You're moving at lightning fast speeds. So sometimes you'll stay plugged into the same amp and do 3 or 4 different parts because you're just moving that fast. What I'll find is that in that case, I'll go, okay, well, that part's too distorted, and there's a frequency buildup. If you use the same guitar and the same amp for all your parts when you're recording, there's a frequency buildup that everything can start to crowd each other. So that's the benefit of switching to a different amp, or quite often a different guitar, like a Gretsch or something that really sounds unusual. Then you start making space for all the different sounds. So that's the benefit to using different amps. But if you're crafty with your guitars and your clean and dirty kind of settings and finding sweet spots, you can actually do the same thing with one amp. You just have to work a little harder.
So what you said about trying different speakers in the same cabinet, I was wondering if we could actually try that out, because I sort of had control over your aux over there using Wi-Fi. So right now we're playing through the 212 AC30 cabinet. So we're going to leave everything exactly the same, and I'm just going to switch through to a couple of different cabinets.
The last thing sounded tremendous.
Oh, good. Turn up all the way. What's that?
So that's a 212 cabinet with some Celestion 65-watt speakers.
Oh, yeah.
So now we can switch to a 4x12, which is definitely not something you'll see in a Vox every day. I don't know how it's going to sound.
Yeah, I like that. A lot of bottom end, though.
Yeah. So now we can go to a 4x12 greenback Marshall cab.
That's great.
Or even down to a small 110 cab, so kind of like a Princeton thing.
That sounds really good today. That's the other thing. On different days and different, I find with guitar parts, if I'm working really hard and listening to a lot of guitar parts, after 2 hours, I walk away, I walk back in, my ears are rested, and things sound different. So that's the other thing about distorted guitar. You can get fatigued really quickly with your ears, and it's nice to come back fresh.
Cool. So let's try one last one. So here's a 112. Kind of like a tweet kind of thing.
Right. And less compressed. Nice.
So yeah, so this is all done switching these virtual cabinets and speakers, and we're not even starting to mess with microphones yet, and that might probably be too much for this little seminar. But it's a lot of fun, and there's a, compared to doing this in real life, which takes a lot of time and a lot of practice and knowledge, this is all doable just by a few clicks.
The other thing, there's not really too many things in there.
Nope.
There's just a handful of options that are kind of curated to be the best options.
Yeah.
It's one of the things I like about it.
Do you guys? Oh, another question. You have to have an amp in front of it. It's designed to basically take the place of your cabinet and speakers and microphones, but the amp you have to have.
But the simpler the amp, I've found, the better the aux sounds. So
It's really true. And the other thing is, I find, and I've heard you talk about this on your YouTube channel, that, the great place to go to is the semi-clean. There's so much you can do with, it's not super brittle and clean where it has a lot of spikes, but it's just semi-clean and you can dig in, but you can still play chords. And I find that most of the direct guitar recording devices, you can either be really clean or like super saturated, but that sort of in-between thing is so hard for me to get. And so being able to use my old Fender amp or a Vox amp or a Marshall amp that I really like and use the aux, I can get that semi-clean sound, which you're getting, and it sounds real. It's important.
clean and dirty at the same time. Yeah.
I was going to ask, kind of aux box thing aside, with your all's, sort of the history that you've had playing different guitars, different amps, are there equations that are pretty well known, especially amongst like more pro players, with things like using specific styles of maybe a humbucker works better with a KT88 or things like that? Are there like sure known facts for just decent, all around good tone?
At this point, absolutely. I mean, that's a great question. I have trouble remembering things. So, like our friend Pete Thorne remembers everything. So he can tell you exactly what is in, But if I put a set of pickups in a guitar 2 years later, I'm going, what were these? Well, they sound good. But yes, there's, if you want to sound, a Van Halen sound, you can. It's all out there. If you want to, AC/DC sound, it's all out there. It's all known at this point.
I think the thing that you said when we first started is really good, is that with a good 57 mic, that's a great place to start. I think that works for almost any guitar sound. It's a great place to start. And, there are, there's different recipes that you can read that different engineers do, but it really also has a lot to do with the mic pre that you're running through. It's a big part of it, where you can have a 57 and you can run into an old Neve and it'll sound a certain way, and you can run into a really pristine, newer preamp and it might sound great, but it's going to sound really different. And also, everybody's hands has more to do with any of the miking or any of that kind of stuff. It's really, I just think the way your hands hold the strings and the way your pick hits the strings has so much to do with how you sound.
Yeah, the way your hands touch the guitar. I saw Larry Carlton twice last week at a little club in L.A., and he's 70 now. And I was just really impressed by that fact, particularly his left hand, the way it touches the guitar. It's him. That's the way he sounds. And it's that way for everybody. So it's a good argument for just practicing and practicing more. It is in the hands. I mean, it really is, ultimately.
Yes?
You were talking a little bit earlier, a few minutes ago, about the effect that speaker cabinets and speaker selection and stuff has, and I totally agree with you. When I started back in the 70s playing out, almost every top of the line amplifier maker, Fenders, top of the line boogies, was JBLs. And then on the English side, you had Celestions. Now, I stepped away for 25 years and came back. Now I can even find a top of the line amp that even has anything with JBL anywhere. Do you remember or transition what happened?
I have a story about that, but I don't want to go.
Go ahead.
Okay, so when I was working in the 80s, I worked for Neil Giraldo from Pat Benatar's band, and he used Marshalls with EVM 12L speakers, which are 200-watt speakers. They're really efficient. And I don't know, and they sounded great, but I don't know how we did it, because I tried those speakers recently, and they were just too clean. So I don't know what happened. I think just everybody decided that those really, really high-end, ultra-efficient speakers were too cold sounding, I guess. I have the same, I wonder the same thing. You just don't, nobody uses them. It's all Celestions. It's all, 3 kinds of Celestions, for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a Celestion, and the eminent speakers I also really like. And I always go for a speaker that breaks up. And those JBLs, I mean, I could never play through them. They were just they were way too clean for me. But I think there's one other really important point that might be the most important point of this whole thing, is that the room your amp is in has as much to do with the microphone or the speaker. If you're in a little boxy room with some square wave, your amp's going to sound bad no matter what you do.
True.
And if you're in a huge tiled room, it might be too clangy sounding. And if you have an ISO box, it's going to sound like the ISO box. So I think that's the other thing, that the room you're in and the room you're putting your amp in is incredibly important. And once again, that's what's great about the aux, is you can dial in the room, and they've recorded all these speakers in really good rooms. So
How big is your tracking room at home?
it's pretty big. I've got a drum room that's probably, if you went halfway down this aisle and halfway down the room, it's that big of a drum room. And then I've got a big control room, and I have 2 ISO booths. So it's pretty big.
Yeah, and I have a vault in my garage that I built. That's not a great environment, but I actually kind of do some treatments on it with bass traps that are, really primitive, and that helps. But what happens is that even with a 57 in front of a 12-inch speaker, any small environment, there's so much bottom end that comes back and pollutes, even the 57's close miking it. So much bottom end comes back and pollutes the sound. At first you think, oh, this is really fat. I've got all this nice bottom end. But what it's doing is it's stealing, it's kind of messing with this beautiful even frequency response and kind of messing with your top end. So that's the other good thing about the Vox, because I don't have the room he has, and I don't know that anybody in this room has the room he has. Do any of you have giant soundproof recording rooms to record in? I don't. He does, but I don't think anybody else does. So it's a great tool.
I just wanted to get back real quickly to this talk about speakers breaking up, because that's one of the things that the UA engineers worked really hard on perfecting in the aux, because it's something that really makes a big difference to the sound. So all these different characteristics that happen when you push a speaker really hard is one of the hardest things to simulate in when you do speaker simulation. Typically, a lot of these things you'll just roll off the top end a little bit and you'll say, here's speaker simulation, but that's not really what's happening inside a speaker. It's very dynamic and it's really hard to do. So the aux will basically simulate the speaker breaking up. It'll simulate cone cry, which will actually like create overtones that wasn't there, just from the guitar by itself. So I think one fun thing, because the speaker drive is actually right there as a knob. Maybe you guys want to hear it if you play, Tim?
You have mine actually.
Yeah, I had. It's like,
Or do you have it set like mostly all
I
the way up?
cranked it pretty much all the way up. Because
Yeah, I would. It sounds like a speaker.
yeah, and sorry for interrupting. I think there's a question here. Yeah.
When you guys are playing in a live room, what are your go-to mic setups on your amps?
For me, I have a few things, but I have a 57 and a Royer 122V, which is their tube ribbon mic, which I just got recently, and it sounds really great.
I use in my studio, I use a 57, and sometimes I do that combination of the 57 and a Royer. There's a company called Mic Tech, and it's kind of a more affordable microphone. And an engineer named Ray Kennedy, who does the Steve Earle records, had turned me on to using the Mic Tech drum mics on guitars, and it just looks like a 57. And it's their tom-tom mic, and it has a letter and then 10 after it. If you look up Mic Tech, it's MICTEK, and then it has a 10, something 10, and it sounds like a 57, but it has a wider dynamic range. So a lot of times you don't want a wider dynamic range because it's going to eat up into the other instruments. But a lot of times, if the guitar is really out front and featured, I'll use that mic tech. It's like a 57 on steroids.
I want one of those.
Yes.
I was watching a pretty popular recording engineer, who's also a guitarist, a couple weeks ago, and he said he was struggling with his tone, but he had forgotten about the tone knob on his guitar. And he said because he's adjusted everything but the tone knob. What do you guys do with your tone knobs on your guitar? Do you set it and leave it, or do you adjust it much?
I work the tone knob a lot. The tone knob is really, really important. I actually like I like the neck pickup with the tone rolled off, which I mean it's like. Which is kind of that Clapton woman tone.
Yeah.
I love that sound. But if my tone is all the way up, this guitar is kind of bright. As opposed to. It's a little more voice sounding, I think.
I don't use the tone knob that much, but if it's too bright, I'll turn it down to 7 on a guitar like this. I generally try and work the amp more than the tone knob. If I'm being totally honest, I probably should. I will from now on. Oops, I forgot. The great thing is that you do this for a long time, and I did a session once where I couldn't find a sound. It's because I had the wah-wah pedal on.
I've
the
done
wall-
that.
Yeah, of
I've done
course.
that.
It's
so embarrassing.
It's so embarrassing, and you're wasting all this time and money, and you're going, yeah, it sounds just so harsh and bright. And then you start blaming the engineer, and you look down and you go, oh.
Okay. Well, there's either time for one more question, or maybe if you guys can play us out, that would be a cool way to end this.
Whatever you want to do, man, I'm good. Now let me tune. I should probably do the same thing. That won't take too long.
I brought some other sound clips of the aux that we didn't get to. Maybe there's a way that I can post them or something like that. The live Chet Chesney thing I can't post, but I've got a couple things where I recorded in the studio, and it was at my place, and all the guitar, actually the bass as well. I tried playing the bass through it just to see what would happen. It's all recorded through the aux, so I brought those because I knew that's what we were doing today. So maybe there's a way to post those and you can hear what it sounds like in the context of a band, you know.